So, of course, we're going to start by talking about authority. In Chapter 12, I've posted a lot of videos, and most of them are really interesting and extremely important for you understanding this chapter. Social psychology, which happens to be what I have my PhD in, has probably done the most famous studies done in psychology, but almost also the most unethical studies done in psychology. So Milgram and Zimbardo, which maybe you've heard about both of those studies before, were done before psychology came up with a standard of ethics, and it was those studies that led us to develop a standard of ethics that we now need to follow. So before I talk about this, I actually think maybe you should pause and watch the Milgram experiment. You might also want to look at my dad's stuff that I posted about World War II. So go ahead and do that and pause and come back. So, first of all, my dad's stuff. In that letter, he asks what kind of person could do a thing like that. And that is actually what Stanley Milgram was trying to answer back in the 60s. We were still reeling from World War II and the atrocities done there, and how could people follow orders to do such atrocious things. And so his original idea was to do a study where he compared Americans with Germans, because he thought there was something about the German culture that must make them be very, very obedient. But of course he started with the easier sample to get, which was Americans. So as you saw, he set up the experiment where he had people come in and they met up with an experimenter in that white lab coat, and another person that was supposedly just another guy walking in off the street, but he was really on the experiment, and we call someone like that a Confederate. And so they sat down, as you saw, and the experimenter was supposed to increase the voltage for every mistake the other person made. And hopefully you gathered from that 65% of people went all the way to the end of the board where they thought that guy was unconscious, okay, or dead, probably dead, without, kind of batting an eye. They weren't under threat, and if you didn't follow orders in Nazi Germany, you were going to die, your family was going to die. And so Milgram never went on to do the German part of the experiment because he didn't need to. If 65% of Americans would shock a person to death just because some guy in a lab coat that they'd never met before told them to, then of course people in those more extreme situations would follow orders. Milgram then went on to look at a lot of varieties to see what made obedience go up or down. So for example, he found that when the subject had to actually shove the guy's hand down onto a shock plate and watch him scream, that obedience went down quite a bit into the 30 percentile, which is still too high as far as I'm concerned. Also, when the experimenter in the lab coat phoned in the orders rather than sitting right next to him, obedience went fairly far down. Also, the experiment was done at Yale University. When they moved the experiment to kind of a rundown location and didn't say it was associated with Yale, obedience dropped by about 10%. Another one of his versions he did was he had a situation where, yeah, there was the regular subject shocking somebody else, but he also had a couple other people in the room supposedly shocking other people. And when one of those other Confederates would say, hey, I'm not going to do this anymore, I'm not going to shock this guy, that's when the real subject would quit too. So we're willing to defy obedience, but only if somebody else does it first. So I really hope you watch that video. Now, that's the Milgram experiment. And those people were probably experiencing all kinds of cognitive dissonance. Dissonance is when you do something that contradicts with your own values or attitudes. So in that study, they were shocking a guy when they probably thought of themselves as good, kind people. So that created a lot of tension in them. And you could see it. I mean, the guy was having trouble breathing. He was obviously upset. So there were definite signs of that internal inconsistency. Okay, so you want to pause and watch the Stanford Prison Study now. Hopefully you've watched it. So in this study, it's amazing this study worked. I wouldn't have thought it would, but really he was looking at the impact of roles that we are given on our behavior. So when you're assigned a prison guard, how do you act? When you're assigned a prisoner, how do you act? And you all are presumably on the cusp of moving into new careers. And I promise you, they're going to change who you are and how you act and what your values are. You know, I was a student once one day who didn't want to do any homework and, you know, hated when teachers assign things. But now that I'm a teacher, I see things very differently. So your role really very much determines who you are. And now you have a chance to decide that. But after that, it changes you. Okay. Let's come down to ASH conformity studies. So there's a video. Again, you should go ahead and watch that, maybe before I talk about it. And there's a really funny video after that. It's only about 2 minutes long. Okay, so ASH was interested in conformity. By the way, let me define some things. Back up here with obedience. Obedience, when there's obedience, there's both an authority and a direct command or request. There's someone who has some kind of power over you, or at least perceived power, asking that you do something. Okay, that's obedience. Conformity is when nobody's asking you to do anything, and there's no direct request, but you go along because there are social norms. Okay, nobody's saying anything, nobody's doing anything. Hopefully you already watched that elevator video. If not, stop now, go watch it. Okay, but we follow social norms. We know where our eyes are supposed to be. We know we're not supposed to get into in-depth emotional conversations with people on the elevator. We know we're supposed to face the doors, so on and so forth. But nobody's telling us to. Nobody's asking us to, but you can see how powerful that is. Now, there's two types of influence in conformity. There's normative influence and there's informational influence. Okay, so normative influence is when you go along to fit in. Okay, so you go along to fit in. That's the only reason you're going along. So, for example, right now, I'm doing all my lectures in my PJs. And if I could live life in my PJs, I would be very happy. But because of normative influence, when I teach you face-to-face, I dress a little better, not much, but a little better because there is pressure to behave in a certain way. I would not feel okay coming into my jammies to teach. Informational influence is when you are conforming because you think the group knows the right thing to do. So if you've ever gone to a church that wasn't yours, a different religion, you probably just followed what everybody else was. Get up when they get up, sit down when they sit down, shake hands when they shake hands, so on and so forth, because you don't know any better. So you really are relying on the group for information of how to act in that situation. Okay, so hopefully that makes some sense to you. All right, so we have obedience up here, which is there's an authority and there's a direct request. Conformity, no authority, no request. Persuasion, which is where we are now, there's a request, but the person has no power over you. And marketing and sales is our most obvious example of persuasion, things we want to get people to do. So there's two routes that they can go to for persuading people. There's what's called a central route, which is persuading people with arguments and information. And there's a peripheral route, which is going through a more emotional route, liking, attractiveness, happiness, guilt. So again, things like that. So for example, the one that's just jumped into my mind for the peripheral route is those ASPCA, the dogs are suffering, the cats are suffering. Those are so hard, I actually turn them off so they're not persuading me because they're a little too painful. Or commercials with catchy jingles, or commercials with attractive people. They're not saying this is a great product. They're trying to persuade you via some other more superficial route to buy their product. Meanwhile, with central root, they're actually using kind of logic and rational reasoning. So if a car commercial is saying, you know, you get so many miles per gallon, you get, you know, it has a great warranty, that's central root persuasion. Foot in the door is where you ask for something small, and then later on you ask for a related but bigger favor. So they did this study where, let's say you were all in class right now, and half of you were in the room, and I said, you know, I'm in charge of the blood drive on campus. Would you all wear a sticker today that says, please give blood? Okay. And then the other half of the class isn't there. Now, most of you would comply with that simple little request that I make. Now, let's say it's a week later, everybody's in the room, and I say, hey, today's the blood drive. Will you please go give blood? Okay. The research says that the people who wore the sticker for me are more likely to agree than not. Okay. And what the research finds is we do not like to be inconsistent with ourselves. So if we wore that sticker all day that said, please give blood, we don't like to go against what we kind of publicly announced. And so we're more likely to agree with that. So that's foot in the door. Small request followed by a larger but related request. Okay, I'm going to stop there and we'll come back for the next section. All right, bye-bye.